Chapter 36. Upon Beiji Hill, the Crown Prince falls into the Devil's Nest. Shi Lian's sudden leap over the edge was certainly alarming, but his two attendants were more than aware of his capabilities. Mu Qing didn't bother to move, though Feng Xin went over and helped pull him up. Shi Lian only used a little strength to pull up, and the young soldier was hauled up along with him, and the two of them found their feet on the tower once more. "Who's your captain? Why are you hiding here?" Shi Lian asked. The young soldier's arms and head were wrapped with bandages, and there were spots of blood seeping through. It appeared he was covered with wounds. This wasn't strange, as there were many wounded soldiers all wrapped up like this after battle today. However, hiding silently in the shadows was highly suspicious. "He'd better not be a Yong'an spy. Tie him up and interrogate him," Mu Qing advised. Shi Lian suspected the same, but the imperial capital was rigorously guarded and the chance of enemies sneaking in was low, unless it was Lang Ying. However, this young soldier was clearly only a child, barely of age. Feng Xin, though, spoke up in amazement. "Your Highness, you don't remember this brat. During the battle today, he kept charging forward, throwing himself ahead of you at the front of the formation." "Oh, really?" Shi Lian said, slightly taken aback. In the midst of all the killing that day, he'd had no time to notice anything. He was solely focused on striking back every time someone raised a sword against him. He hadn't even bothered with Feng Xin and Mu Qing, so how could he notice some little soldier? Feng Xin was sure. "It's him. I remember this brat. His charge was quite aggressive, like he didn't care about his life at all." Hearing this, Shi Lian scrutinized this young soldier carefully. For some reason the boy stood taller, his shoulders squared and head raised, as if he was a little stiff, but also like he was standing at attention. "Even so, he shouldn't be sneaking around and hiding here," Mu Qing remarked. Who knows if he's here to spy or eavesdrop?" Despite his words, he still relaxed his guard. Due to the Shinla military's campaign promoting their holy crusade by the army of God, there were quite a few young people who enlisted just to follow Shi Lian, many just as young as this boy. Most were loyal devotees who grew up worshipping his divine statues and listening to his tales of valor. They all wanted to sneak close, if only to steal a glimpse of the martial god. It wasn't the first or even the second time something like this had happened, so it wasn't anything special. "All right. It was a false alarm," Shi Lian said. Then he turned to the young soldier and said warmly, "I must have scared you just now. Sorry." Yet the boy didn't look frightened and only stood straighter. "Your Highness—" He trailed off and suddenly lunged at Shi Lian. Shi Lian thought the boy was trying to ambush him and sidestepped immediately to dodge, his hand raised and ready to chop down. With his might, just one strike would kill the boy on the spot. But just then he felt a rush of cold air behind him. His hand changed track abruptly. His wrist twisted and he caught a sniping arrow that had been aimed at his back. It turned out that the boy had tried to tackle him because he had seen the glint of the arrow flying through the air. Shi Lian had been leaning against the wall of the parapet at first, but even after being attacked from behind, he wasn't scared in the slightest. He jumped onto the wall to look downward. In the vast fields before the city gates, he could faintly see the lone figure of a man standing in the distance. Since he wore dark-colored clothing and blended into the night, he was difficult to spot. Feng Xin was instantly at Shi Lian's side. He drew his bow and shot. However, it seemed that the man had already calculated the distance and stood just out of reach. The one arrow he shot got Shi Lian's attention, so he waved, then turned swiftly to leave without a word. When Feng Xin's arrow reached him, it was already too late, and it drove into the ground just inches behind the man's retreating feet. Furious, Feng Xin pounded his fist on the wall, sending dust tumbling down. "Who was that?" Who else could it be? "Lang Ying!" Shi Lian shouted. The Shinla soldiers had also noticed strange things afoot. Though they caused quite a stir, the soldiers retained enough caution to not immediately open the gate to give chase and instead reported to the superiors for instruction. Lang Ying waved and left after shooting that one arrow, almost as if he had come specifically to greet Shi Lian. Mu Qing furrowed his brow. Why did he come here? A show of strength. "Yong'an was completely destroyed on the battlefield today," Feng Xin spat angrily, "and he himself barely escaped death at his highness's hands. What strength could he possibly show?" Shi Lian, however, felt that the arrow in his hand had something tied around it. When he brought it to the firelight for further examination, he saw it was a ripped piece of cloth that seemed to come from a rich green brocade. There were traces of wet blood still on the fabric, and when he unfolded it, he found a twisted scribble of the word Qi. Shi Lian immediately clutched that fabric and demanded, "Where's Qirong? Is Qirong not at the palace?" Feng Xin turned to the nearby soldiers. "Go to the palace and confirm, quickly." The soldiers left immediately. That cloth was indeed a corner from the sleeve of Qirong's favorite robe, and Lang Ying was known for his stealth, so there was a high probability that Qirong had been kidnapped. Shilian knew there was no time to waste. I'm going after him to find out. Seeing that Fengshen had returned, he added, You two watch over the city gates, but don't make any moves. This might be a ploy to lure us out of the city. Fengshen shrugged his bow onto his back. You're not bringing anyone. Shilian didn't want Shinle to deploy soldiers if there wasn't a major offense from Yong'an's side. If Qirong had fallen into enemy hands, then Shilian himself could bring him back. If he brought troops with him, it would be war, and it wouldn't end with only 1 or 2 dead. At the moment, Shilian just wanted to minimize losses. No, they can't do anything to me. He lightly pushed off the wall and leapt over, landing softly down on the ground. Then he dashed off in the direction that Lang Ying had retreated. After he'd been running for a while, he heard footsteps catching up to him from behind. When he turned his head to look, he saw the young soldier. I don't need help! Go back! Shilian shouted at him. The boy shook his head. Go back! Shilian tried again. Then he sped up, leaving the boy far behind. He lost sight of him in an instant. After running for a dozen kilometers, he reached a mountaintop. This mountain wasn't steep. It was more like a hill. Thus, it was called Beiji Hill. That is, Smallback. According to their scouts, after the people of Yong'an retreated from the city walls, their armed forces and civilizations had started sheltering here. Beiji Hill was thick with foliage, and in the deep night strange noises wrestled from all throughout the dark forest, as if there were countless creatures lying low, watching. Shilian went further into the mountain, and searched with his breath held for a long time. Then suddenly, he saw a form in the distance, a tall, humanoid shape hanging from a tree. He looked closely, then cried, Qirong! It was indeed Qirong. He was hung upside down from a tree, and it looked like he had fainted from a severe beating he'd clearly received. Blood ran downward from his nose, and one of his eyes was blackened. Shilian drew his sword and cut the rope, caught the fallen Qirong, then slapped him repeatedly in the face. Qirong slowly came to and shouted at the sight of him, Cousin Crown Prince! Shilian was just loosening his bindings when he felt coldness at his back. He immediately swung his sword out behind him. As he turned, he saw that it was Lang Ying, brandishing a great sword and lunging at him. The two swords clashed, the blades resounding as they traded blows, but it wasn't long before Shilian had knocked Lang Ying's sword flying. Then Shilian kicked his legs, tripping him, and brought his sword to the attacker's throat to end the fight. You know you are not my equal. Stop fighting! They'd faced off earlier that day on the battlefield. Everyone who charged at Shilian was killed, except Lang Ying, who survived, taking Shilian's sword head-on and dragged himself away wounded. Anyone could see that Lang Ying was the leader of the Yong'an refugees, so Shilian telling him to stop fighting naturally implied something much deeper. As long as your people do not invade further, I promise that the soldiers of the imperial capital will not attack you. Take the water and the rations. Leave. Lang Ying lay on the ground and stared him straight into the eyes, with a gaze that made him uncomfortable. Your Highness, do you think what you're doing is right? Shilian stiffened. Next to him, Qirong cussed. Cut the crap! Don't you know who my cousin Crown Prince is? He's a god of heaven. Do you seriously think he's wrong and you're right, you treacherous dogs? Qirong, be quiet! Shilian barked. He couldn't answer Lang Ying's question. Deep down, he did feel that there was something wrong with what he'd done. But it was the best plan he could think of. Could he really leave Shinle unprotected against the invasion and allow the Yong'an rebels to freely storm the wall again and again, perhaps even eventually breaching the capital itself? If only 1 or 2 swung their swords at him, he could simply knock them out to end things without going too far. But on the battlefield, blades were relentless and merciless. He simply didn't have the energy to knock everyone out. All he could do was stop himself from feeling and swing his sword. In asking him that question, Lang Ying had awoken a voice deep within. Do you think what you're doing is right? Qirong didn't have this inner dilemma and kept running his mouth. What did I say wrong? Cousin, since you're here, hurry and kill all these damn thieves. A dozen of them ganged up on me when I was alone and beat me up. Qirong was a figure of domineering arrogance within the capital, so naturally there were many from Yong'an who hated him, and they leapt at this chance to take revenge. Of course, there were also many from Shinle who hated him. Shilian had no time for him right now, and addressed Lang Ying. What do you want? If you want rain, Yong'an will have rain. If you want gold, I'll push over the golden statues and give them to you. If you want food, I'll think of a way. Just don't start a war. Can't we solve this together and find a third path? Shilian blurted those words in spite of himself. Lang Ying might not have understood what third path meant, but he answered without hesitation. I don't want anything, and I don't need anything. The only thing I want is for the kingdom of Shinla to cease to exist. I need it to disappear. His tone was blank, but his words were fearsome. A moment later, Shilian said gravely, If you attack, I won't be able to sit back and watch. You have no chance of winning. Even if all your Yong'an followers will surely die. Must you do this? Yes, Lang Ying said. His answer was so calm, so firm, that Shilian couldn't say anything back. His fists clenched and his knuckles cracked. I know you're a god, Lang Ying said, emphasizing every word. That's okay. Even if you're a god, you can't stop me. Shilian knew Lang Ying's words were the truth simply because his tone was more than familiar to him. It was the determination of one steeped in duty, one who would never consider turning back. When Shilian said to Junwoo, Even if the heavens say I must die, the determination within him was exactly the same as Lang Ying's. Lang Ying's words were practically a proclamation that he would ceaselessly call forth the people of Yong'an in an endless offense. So Shilian knew what he must do. The sword in Shilian's grip was normally held in one hand, but now he gripped it with both. Just as he was about to pierce Lang Ying's throat with his trembling hands, there was suddenly an odd scrunch sound behind him, and then a cackling laugh. Shilian was shocked that anyone could appear so soundlessly, so undetected. When he looked back, his eyes widened. Normally, enemy soldiers would appear at times like this. Shilian had already had countless swords pointed at him, so he was expecting a sea of blades. Instead, he saw a single, very odd figure. The person wore ghastly white funeral clothes, and his face bore a ghastly white mask that was extremely bizarre, one half crying, the other half smiling. He was seated on a vine hung low between two trees, and that scrunch came from him swaying back and forth on that vine as if it were a swing. When he saw Shilian looking back, he raised his hands and slowly clapped. He cackled again, and the noise raised the hair on Shilian's neck. What are you? Shilian said sharply. Illustration. What, indeed? His instincts told him clearly that this thing wasn't human. Shilian suddenly noticed that the feel of the sword in his hands was wrong. And at the same moment, Chirong screamed. When he turned back to look, the ground in front of him had split wide open in a deep fissure, and Lang Ying, who was lying on the ground, was being swallowed by that gap. The ground was rapidly closing its mouth, and without thinking, Shilian stabbed into the heart of the earth. He felt the tip of his sword pierce soil, not flesh. Only then did Shilian realize that he'd failed to kill Lang Ying. He couldn't tell whether he felt regret or relief. The white-clothed being started cackling again. Shilian raised his sword and flung it at him. The strike was fast as lightning, and it shot through the being and nailed him to the tree behind. He crumpled to the ground without uttering a single sound. Shilian rushed over to check, but all that was left was a pile of white robes. The one wearing those robes had disappeared into thin air. That being's appearance and disappearance were both peculiar to the extreme. Shilian was in shock and didn't dare drop his guard. Picking Chirong off the ground with one hand, Shilian said, "Let's go!" Yet Chirong whined, "Let's not go! Cousin, let's set fire to this mountain. There's a bunch of Yong'an people around. Those boorish radicals who wouldn't leave the city gates are all hiding here. Let's set a fire and torch this place clean." Shilian dragged him away for some distance, and the farther they went, the more Shilian felt the air grow thicker and thicker with yin energy, as if countless eyes were watching them. "Did you not just see that odd being?" he snapped. "We shouldn't stick around." "So what?" Chirong asked. "You're a god. You're not afraid of some little devils, are you? If they dare obstruct you, just kill them." Let's go back first, Shilian said. When Shilian dismissed his rant out of hand and refused to set the mountain ablaze, Qirong's eyes bulged with rage. Why? Those people beat me to a pulp and are bent on antagonizing us. You heard him. He wants to annihilate Shinla. He wants to annihilate our kingdom. Why don't you kill them all? Why don't you kill them all off like you did today on the battlefield? Shilian's breath hitched, and he shouted angrily, Why is it always kill, kill, kill rattling around in your head? Soldiers and civilians are different. How are they different? Qirong countered. Aren't they all people? Isn't killing the same thing either way? It was like he had stabbed Shilian right where it hurt, and a burst of anger roiled up. You! Just then he felt something tighten around his ankle. When he looked down, a swollen hand had poked out of the bushes and seized his boot. From up ahead came several thudding sounds. 7 or 8 humanoid forms fell from the trees like rain, and they puddled on the ground, unable to get up. While they were shaped like humans, there was not a shred of clothing on their backs, and they slowly squirmed toward them like giant fleshy worms. Qirong cried out in fright, Who are they? Shilian chopped off the hand with his sword and said darkly, They're not human. They're Binu. Shilian had never heard of Binu sightings in the mountains near the imperial capital before. Even if there were nefarious creatures lurking about, they were usually quickly exterminated by the cultivators of the Royal Holy Temple. That meant these Binu were intentionally let loose by someone. Shilian never expected this war to involve anything inhuman, but thinking back on everything that had happened, he believed more and more that those things were allied with Lang Ying, and that the kidnapping Qirong was nothing more than a ploy to lure Shilian out. Nonetheless, he had no time to think at the moment. He could cleanly slice 7 or 8 Binu in half with one swing of his sword, but when Binu appeared, they usually came in hordes. Sure enough, the bushes and trees all around them started to rustle, and they only shook harder, and more fleshy forms crawled out and came for Shilian. He could kill 10 with one strike, but 20 more would lunge at the same moment. As Shilian struck them endlessly, a Binu on a tree focused in on Shilian's back and leapt down to seize him. Before it could come close enough to succeed, it was sliced up in a flash. Qirong was unarmed, so it couldn't have been him. Shilian turned to look and saw the one who swung the sword. It was that young soldier. He'd been left in the dust by Shilian at the city gates, but he somehow still managed to follow along and find them. Although that boy was carrying nothing but a worn sword, he was still highly effective and struck down many of the Binu. Those things crawled on the ground and stretched thick, glue-like fluid and secreted thick, glue-like fluids from their bodies, and Qirong was screaming at how disgusting they were. He stomped on the head of one that looked weak, and noticed that the creature wasn't exactly a threat. So they're not that tough? He asked, bewildered. But Qirong didn't know that Binu usually appeared alongside crueler, more violent evils. Shilian bit his lip and broke the skin. Wiping the blood on 2 fingers of his right hand, he smeared it on his blade and shoved the sword into Qirong's hands. You two, take this sword and go. Nothing will dare approach you. Don't turn back, no matter what you hear. Remember, don't look back. Cousin, Qirong protested. Shilian cut him off. The powerful ones will be coming along right behind them. I won't be able to take care of you once they show up. You need to go back and report. Qirong didn't reply, just ran away frantically, holding the sword. The sacred sword in his hands held the essence of Shilian's divinity, and all along the road, no Binu or other evils would dare come close. His path was unbound, and he disappeared quickly. The young soldier, however, still didn't leave. Qirong was already long gone, and Shilian didn't have another sacred sword to give him for protection. His only remaining defense was shooting spiritual blasts from his palms. The boy was working hard trying to help, and after an instant's time, all the Binu were finally exterminated. The ground was covered in sticky fluids and corpses, and the stench was stifling. Once Shilian was sure not a single Binu had escaped, he calmed his breath and turned to the boy. You're pretty good with that sword. The boy gripped his weapon harder, and although he was still panting, he instantly stood at attention again. Yes, sir. I wasn't giving you orders, so why are you saying yes, sir? Shilian asked. When I ordered you to run, why didn't you say yes, sir, then? Yes, sir, that boy answered, but he realized that his response was strange and stood even stiffer. Shilian shook his head, pondered briefly, and suddenly his lips curled up. But you'd be better suited to a saber. And that is chapter 36.